Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Hessman with IFMA, the International Food Service Manufacturers Association. Just a reminder, this call is being recorded, so everyone except for Warren is muted, and we'll post this recording on our website, ifmaworld.com. Welcome to our Post-Marketing and Sales Leaders Forum webinar series, where we are taking a deeper dive at some of the topics that we uncovered at our conference in August in St. Louis. At IFMA, our mission is to enable our member community to focus on critical issues affecting their businesses and the industry. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Warren Solochek. He's the president of the Foodservice Practice at the NPD Group. We will be taking questions at the end of Warren's presentation, so please type them into the chat feature on the webinar software. And with that, I will turn it over to Warren for Generation Z, connecting with the next generation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. A little bit of background on this topic. When we were in St. Louis in early August, one of the topics that got covered off was how to deal with Gen Z. We as an industry have spent a lot of time talking about millennials. And I think the industry wasn't really very well prepared for how we were going to deal with millennials. And we've done a lot of catch-up over the last 4 or 5 years to better understand that age cohort. As I was talking with the folks at IFMA about this topic, I thought that perhaps the value of this discussion would really be, okay, everybody's got a pretty decent handle on the current generation that's in vogue, and the current generation that is frankly one of the biggest components of the entire U.S. population. But let's start thinking ahead, and let's start thinking about what's going to happen next so that we're not caught unawares by Gen Z. And essentially our definition of Gen Z are those people, there's a lot of definitions floating around out there. The definition that we used when we are going to look at this data are going to be those who are 18 and under. Some people use 22 and under, some people use 24 and under. We're going to stick with 18 and under, and as we go through our discussion, what we're going to do is we're going to break it into teenagers and those that are 12 and younger. And the reason why we're going to do that is, as part of our CREST survey, we can actually get direct inputs from teenagers, whereas for those who are younger, we're dependent upon parents. And so where possible, we'd like to give you actual behavioral information as we go through our discussion. So this is my agenda for the day. I promise you that we won't go over an hour. I want to spend just a couple of seconds and talk about the data sources. I want to talk about what's happening in the food service industry as a whole and how the different generational cohorts use restaurants. Then we'll drill down a little bit and talk about kids and teens and how they compare, and then maybe some key takeaways for all of you as manufacturers and what you can do from a product planning standpoint and how you can work with your customers in terms of working with them to better serve those households that have younger members. Because as we go through this, one of the key things you'll take away is that households with kids have been a big part of the reason why industry growth has been so slow, because those households have definitely cut back on the amount of times that they use restaurants. So with that being said, just a quick reminder, most of the data we're going to be looking through today is based on CREST. I know some of the folks who are on this call are subscribers to the service. CREST is a syndicated consumer data source. Every day we go out to 2,300 adults and teens, and we ask them if they've had a snack or a meal outside of their home yesterday. So we're always asking just about yesterday's behavior so that we get good recall. We asked them a series of questions, which I'll show you in a second. But the key thing for you to know is what we're talking about are commercially prepared meals and snacks, both that come from restaurants as well as food purchased for immediate consumption that comes out of C-stores or supermarkets or club stores or mass merchants. And so it's a pretty robust database. We have hundreds of thousands of people who provide us with what they did outside of their home yesterday. It's a very robust database, and it enables us to slice it and dice it a lot of different ways. And so what I'm going to take you through today is kind of a high-level look at this Gen Z cohort and hopefully some good comparisons for you in terms of how they differ from millennials and some of the older groups. As we compile all the data that we get from CRUST, these are really the key questions that are important to the people who are subscribers to this service. So we ask people what they ate and drank. We ask where they went when they got it. We ask when it was, and the when is a day part sort of question. So we say, was it morning meal? Was it an afternoon snack? Was it lunch? Was it supper? So it's self-reported in terms of day part. And then we also ask the time of day it was, which we figure if we're talking about yesterday, people will have a pretty good recollection. So we can overlay the two. But in general, what you'll see is morning meal are those occasions that are really kind of from 6 a.m. to 11. Lunch falls at the normal time. And then we talk about afternoon snack, which is that period between lunch and supper and then after the supper hour. We ask who the respondents were with. Were they alone? Were they with adults? Were they with kids? And how much did they pay? So what was their total check? And then if we know how many people were in the party, we can come up with the average check. So we have a lot of really good metrics. So I think it's important whenever you're talking about the restaurant industry or you're talking about in food in general to go, okay, where do we really source our food from? And so let me kind of take you through the basics. On the left-hand side here, if you look at all the meals and snacks that people eat in-home and away from home, what you'll see is that in-home is still the primary source of all meals and snacks. So 81% of all meals and snacks that people eat on an annual basis source from in-home, which means only 20% come from restaurants. So that's a good news, bad news story. If you are in the restaurant industry, you go, yeah, we have a really small share, but there's a lot of upside potential if we can get people to eat in restaurants as an alternative to eating at home. When you look at it in terms of the dollars spent, though, it's almost 50-50, which, you know, if you do the math, it's really simple math, and you can see that the average spend when people go out to eat on a per-person basis is substantially less or substantially more at restaurants than it would be at home. So I think as you look at this, there's still a lot of opportunity to drive more meals and snacks away from home. It's not like 90% of all the meals that people eat are coming from restaurants. If you take a long-term look at meals and snacks, both in-home and away from home, and our in-home data, by the way, sources to our net eating base, national eating trends. At NPD, another one of the data sources we have is another survey where we ask people to describe to us in a lot of detail all the meals and snacks that they eat over the course of a week. So by occasion, what did they include? How was it prepared? What seasonings did they use? Who ate the meal occasion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the key thing that I want you to take away here is if you look kind of from the start of the recession in 2008, the number of meals and snacks eaten per person at restaurants have declined by about 18 meals and snacks per person per year. So this is the scale for per capita use of restaurants. This is the scale for in-home eating occasions. And what you see is, as we've been declining at restaurants, we've increased the number of meals and snacks we have at home. So you know that Americans have not stopped eating. We are still a generally pretty overweight country. And so if I'm not eating a meal at home, I'm eating it out. But if I'm not eating it out, I'm certainly eating it at home. And I think the difference is there are a lot more smaller occasions that people eat at home. So we have transitioned as a society from eating kind of 3 square meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and supper, to a group of individuals that kind of grazes over the course of the day. And there may not be an official breakfast, there may not be an official lunch, there may not be an official supper. We're eating a number of smaller meals over the course of the day and drinking beverages with many of those. But net, more of those occasions, whether they're big or small, are happening at home. And if you look at why I thought it was important to talk about Gen Z, this chart should help to explain that. So each of these components of the pie provide you with what percentage in millions, each of these groups are. And the key thing that I want you to take away is Gen Z are these 2 pieces of the pie, and they account for they're almost a quarter of the entire U.S. population today. And as seniors begin to age out and these folks begin to pass away, this group is going to become an even larger percentage of the population. And the way to look at this is if this is Gen Z, these are millennials, these are boomers, these are Gen X, and these are boomers. So think of them as those kinds of age cohorts. This is a big cohort today. And so part of the reason why we want to talk about this today is now is the time to start building loyalty with this group of individuals. Now is the time to start trying to attract them with the products that you provide. Because once you start building loyalty, and if you can get them to be more loyal to your product today, you have a greater likelihood of keeping them in your franchise as they age. And so another way to look at this is not only by age, but whether, if you're talking about it by household, whether there are households with or without kids. And so on the left, what you see is households with kids account for about 32% of all U.S. households. That's 37 million households, which is a big, big number. And on the right-hand side, those households with kids, and when I say kids, I'm talking under the age of 18, account for 24% of total restaurant traffic. So again, big component of the total household population, very important component of the restaurant industry. But the problem that we've seen is the fact that since the recession, so now I'm back here in 2008, what we've seen is when the recession hit, households cut back pretty dramatically. This is per capita visits. We saw a pretty steep cutback on the number of visits to restaurants amongst that group. And even though the recession has ended, we have not necessarily seen a recovery, meaning that group of households has not started to go back at an accelerated rate, perhaps to get back to this usage of restaurants. I think this is the new normal. I think that this is what the expectation should be, because right now there are not restaurants offering enough to households with kids to really incent them to come back. And so then you got to wonder and say, okay, if people have cut back, where have the biggest reductions in use of restaurants taken place? And so if we look at all the declines that have taken place, these are the top 3 kind of day parts and meal occasions where people have cut back. So the number 1 place where people have cut back has been at supper. And that makes a lot of sense to us at NPD. This is the occasion which is tends to be the most expensive. This is the meal occasion that tends to be squeezed between a lot of after-school activities and activities that are going on later in the evening. So for households with kids, this is just a tough one to pull off at restaurants. Number two is on-premise versus off-premise. So off-premise is drive-through or carry-out or delivery. And so where we've seen people have cut back is really those visits where people would come in and sit down. So because people are so time crunched for that dinner occasion, there tends to be a greater use in the evening of drive-through and carry-out than there might be for the lunch occasion. And third, it's weekends. And we've seen people cut back on the weekends overall for their use of restaurants because they have a little bit more free time. They have a little bit more time to cook at home. And so they're taking advantage of that time. Really, what restaurants do is help somebody fill in when they're in a time crunch and they don't have time to shop for food, prep that food, cook it, feed the family, and do the dishes. And that's one of the huge benefits that restaurants provide, and that's particularly true of households that have kids in them when the kids are involved in lots and lots of different things. And if you talk specifically to parents of younger kids and you say, what is it that gets you to go to a particular restaurant? These are the top three reasons. And interestingly, the top reason is I go to a restaurant where my kid feels comfortable. My kid likes that restaurant. So the other way to think about it is if you're thinking about atmosphere and you're thinking about ambiance, and it's not a kid-friendly place, younger visitors are certainly going to pick up on that, and they're not going to want to go there. The second piece of it is it's a good value, which means for the amount of money I'm paying, I know I'm going to be able to feed my kid. It's not going to cost me too much. I don't have to worry that if my kid doesn't finish the food 100%, I've wasted my money. And number three means it's a kid-friendly environment, and it's pretty convenient to get to. Tied to that, as a kid-friendly environment, also has to do with the fact that they have a kids menu. So we are still, as adults, dependent, at least starting with kid menus. It's particularly true of younger kids. Although when we were down in St. Louis at the IFMA conference, one of the things that we talked about was the fact is as kids age, as they go from younger to older, their palates become more sophisticated and they are much more used to eating things that their parents might eat. So you might start out with mac and cheese and you might start out with chicken nuggets, but by the time kids get to be 12 or 13 or 14, kids have a very sophisticated palate. They're eating sushi, they're eating Mexican food, they're eating a lot of ethnic foods, and that's what they're looking for in restaurants. It's really hard to convince kind of those middling-aged kids that it's still okay to have chicken nuggets and mac and cheese because they're used to eating much more sophisticated food, whether it be at home or whether it be at other restaurants. But really, this is what it's all about. It's got to be a kid-friendly environment. So as all of you are working with your operators, one of the things you need to be talking to them about not only is the food that they're serving, but how that food is being positioned. And is it an atmosphere in which kids feel welcome? And that's both in terms of seating as well as how they're treated by servers. So what do we know about Gen Z? So a little bit of perhaps social psychology that I think is relevant here. So this is what Gen Z is all about. It's a generation that when they want something, they want it their way, they want it right now, and they want to share their experience with everybody. And the important thing for you to take away is, for this younger group of people, they are technology natives. And by that, what we mean is they've grown up with smartphones. They've grown up on the internet. They know how to search. They know how to take pictures. They know how to send messages. They know how to send pictures. And they are a generation that is much more willing to share their life with everybody who's out there. And so they're looking for interesting sorts of things to take pictures of when they go to restaurants. This is not just a millennial trait. But when you compare them to millennials, the key thing that I think differentiates the two is millennials are all about customization. They're about social responsibility. They're about artisanal food, which is really, it's customized for me. It's a little bit more upscale. Clearly, millennials are a little bit more willing to pay for food that they feel is a little more upscale. And the other thing that millennials really love to do is share. And so if you think about when millennials go out, when they go out and they're out with their friends, there's a lot of sharing going on. It's a lot of small plates. It's going to fast casual pizza sorts of places where everybody can get their own individual pie with their own individual components, and then they still go ahead and they still share each of their pies with their other friends that are there. So this is a group that also has a pretty sharp palate in terms of spiciness, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But this is a group that are really explorers. They're out looking for new things. They're out looking for interesting new, not only restaurants, but tastes and flavors and preparations. So part of what helps differentiate Gen Z today from the other age cohorts is very simply this. So these are the age cohorts I've talked about in the past, going from youngest to oldest. This is their percent of the population. This is their percent of restaurant visits. And so on a per capita basis, what you see is these Gen Zs are the lightest buyers of the entire group. And I think that makes sense given the fact that most of them aren't working. A lot of them are in school, at least during the day, so they're not out at lunch. They're not out at breakfast. And the question is as they transition to millennials and as they get older, is this group going to increase their per capita visits to restaurants, or is it going to stay at a low level? And I think what's ended up happening with the Gen Z kids today is they are just as comfortable eating at home, and they're starting to make their own foods earlier because they're watching the cooking channel and they're watching all these celebrity chefs. And eating at home is okay. When my kids were that age, and this was 10 or 15 years ago, it was a great treat for them to go out, and they wanted to go out all the time. I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. So the challenge we face is getting them to go from here up to here. Now, part of that is employment. As they find jobs, as they go away to school and they're more independent, certainly they're going to be more reliant on restaurants. But even this group, this millennials group, if I look at their per capita restaurant visits 10 years ago, this number was closer to 250. So they've cut back a lot on their restaurant visits. And frankly, they're not going to be increasing over time. And so if you look at these age groups along the top column headings, and you look at where they are increasing their visits over time, we've broken it out into 4 big buckets. This is traditional quick service restaurants. So this is places like McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and Subway and Chick-fil-A. Retail are C-stores and supermarkets where they're buying what we used to call home meal replacements, fast casual restaurants, and full-service restaurants. And so there are 2 key things for you to take away. Number 1 is, across the board, every age cohort is using fast casual restaurants more. And that's a trend we've been seeing for a long time, so that's not necessarily new news. But what this kind of restaurant offers is the perception of health, healthy foods, and fresh foods. And really, the fresh component is becoming a more and more important piece of the puzzle overall. And the reason why I say fresh is it's not necessarily that the food were picked out of the field yesterday. It's the fact that the food are made fresh and they're made just for me. So they're not pre-cooked. Really what I'm doing is I'm going down and I'm creating my own components and I'm putting them together in a meal. You'll notice that retail also has those same characteristics, including a group of C-stores that we call food-forward C-stores. But what's really going on here is these guys are also looking for fresh. So one of the key things that this younger groups, both of these younger age cohorts, are thinking about is fresh food and eating a little bit healthier. When you get to full-service restaurants, there's only one group within all of these age cohorts that are increasing their use of full-service restaurants, and that's seniors. And I think that's a trend that's been going on for years and years and years. So if you look at where teens visit, and so now I've taken that Gen Z and I'm going to break it into two groups. First are teens, and then the second pie chart I'm going to show you, which looks just like this, is going to be those younger kids. But here's some key dynamics. This group, teenagers, account for about 4 billion restaurant visits in a year. That translates to $22.6 billion, or about $580 per visit. And the key thing I want you to take away is this is traditional fast food share of all of their visits. And you notice C-stores and all other retail account for about 16%. So this is that fresh factor, and you add in fast casual, which is 7%, and you're up to almost a quarter of all their visits is really the focus on fresh. So this is teens. When we look at the next group, this is kids 12 and under, more visits because they're going out with their parents, so they're kind of a captive group. They obviously are spending more, but notice that retail is not as big a factor, nor is fast casual, and yet casual dining is a bigger piece of their visits, again, because a lot of these kids are going out with their parents, and this is where their parents are tending to go. They're tending to go to more full-service restaurants. So I think the benefit of looking at this is to say, is this a time when full-service restaurants should be working on some sort of offering that's kid-friendly? And that means more than pancakes and more than mac and cheese. What is it that they can be menuing that's important to these kids, where kids will demand to go back to those restaurants again and again? And if you look at just fast casual, and this is share visits by all these age groups, what you see is fast casual is a big component of for teenagers of all their visits, almost the same as millennials. And then you see as people age, fast casuals are not as important. Neither is it to these younger kids. And I think probably part of the reason why this number is low is because if I'm a parent and I'm taking my kid into a fast casual, my total check is going to be generally pretty high. And so I'm going to be less likely to take them there. I'm going to be more likely to take them to a traditional quick service restaurant. If we look at how each of the age groups tend to use restaurants, these are the 4 primary day parts that we track in CREST. So morning meal, which is breakfast, and AM snack, lunch, and supper, and then PM snack is that occasion between lunch and supper and afterwards. 2 key things I want you to take away. First is for the youngest group of restaurant goers, morning meal is not as important as it is for these other age groups, and that's really because this is a group of people who are not on their way to work. They're traditionally on their way to school, or we hope they're on their way to school, and so morning meal is just not as important. There's a little more time to feed them at home, whereas a lot of these folks get up and they're on the run and they're on their way to work, and so they are using restaurants at a much higher rate. The converse to that is younger age groups tend to be more snack-oriented. Now, one thing I want you to take away from this is the snack today is not the same sort of snack that we might have thought about 10 or 15 years ago. So a snack today might just be a beverage. It might be a frappe, it might be a slushie, it might be hot chocolate. We see a lot of beverage-only occasions at snacking. Or it could be a burger or it could be a taco. So it's not just salted snacks. It's not just frozen snacks. What people are eating in snacking occasions has become much, much broader. The converse to that is as we get older and this group of people are more concerned about their health, snacking as a percentage of all their occasions goes down. If you slice it a different way, this is how each of these groups use restaurants. So on-premise means I go to a restaurant, I order, and I stay and I eat on-premise. Carry-out means I come in, I order, I get my food at the counter, and I leave. Doesn't matter whether it's a full-service restaurant or a quick-service restaurant. Drive-through is obvious, delivery is obvious. And what you see is there is an interesting similarity between the under 18s and probably their parents in terms of use of each of these different kinds of ordering methods. What you see as people age over time, they're much more inclined to eat on premise. The converse to that is those who are younger, though it's a small percentage, are much more likely to use delivery. And obviously this is driven by pizza, right? Kids love to eat pizza. So delivery is a higher percentage for younger than for older. And the other thing that I just wanted to bring to your attention, and this goes back to a comment I made earlier on, which is those which are younger are digital natives. They are much more likely to order digitally than are those of us who are a little bit older. The apps have gotten easier to use. More of those kids have smartphones, and so they are much more likely to order digitally than I might be or my parents might. But the benefit to ordering digitally is the fact that there's an opportunity for a lot of upsell if you can get somebody using your site. And I would have each of you go to the Domino's website or the Papa John's website or the Pizza Hut website. All three of those players are very strong in digital ordering, and just go through the process of ordering food and see how many times there's an opportunity for you to either order a side dish or a dessert or a beverage, which is ultimately going to lead to a higher ring when you order from those restaurants. This is looking at restaurant categories. So these are the top restaurant categories used by younger kids and teens. And so what do you see? First thing you see is QSR burger is number one, regardless of whether you're a young kid or you're an old kid. But notice that number two is QSR pizza pops to the top for younger kids, and it's a little bit lower here amongst teens, whereas teens, their second biggest outlet is C-stores, which is really interesting, and they're using that much more as a snacking location than it is for any sort of main meal. But you can see that pizza and QSR chicken, and think of buckets, think of boxes, think of large quantities that you can come back and feed multiple kids, are much bigger for younger kids than they are for older kids. What you're seeing with older kids and teens is use of fast casual, interestingly drinking a little more coffee and tea. This could also be Starbucks, where kids are going in just to hang out and be with their friends. This is QSR Mexican, could be upscale, so it could be Chipotle. It could be cheap, where it's Taco Bell, and so on and so forth. So you see some really big changes between younger kids and older kids where they're visiting most often. And if you look at it by chain, we've done this two different ways. So these are the top chains under this column heading, and you see that there's not a lot of difference between under 18 and then millennials. So you can see that there's a transition to coffee. You can see that there's a transition to sandwiches. And these are the chains that over-index relative in this demographic group relative to the rest of the population. So what do you see here? You see of the top 5 chains, 4 of them are pizza places, which makes a lot of sense, and number 1 being Little Caesars, that has the least expensive pizzas around, where you can get $5 pizzas and bring them home and feed your kids. And once kids hit that age 18, they're going to a very different set of places. You see a couple of casual dining bar and grill places. You see a couple of fast casual places. So there's a big change that happens once we're able to afford to go out on our own. In terms of the foods that kids eat, these are in rank order from number 1, number 2, number 3, going across. So pizza and fries continue to be the top foods ordered for kids. And those fries are typically coming with kids' meals, but also they're available in small quantities. And I think parents, want to make sure that their kids have something to eat and they're willing to let them eat the fries. So it's this interesting mix of, I would say, perhaps less healthy and then more healthy food. So you're seeing parents kind of trying to balance the good and the bad of what their kids eat. And the question is then, how does this change as kids get older? So then we look at millennials, and these are the places where millennials over-index versus Gen Z. So you see a lot of handheld. So sandwiches and burgers and Mexican food and breakfast sandwiches. You see coffee and tea become a much more important component of what these guys are buying. And the key to this is if you can get millennials to order beverages in addition to foods, the average ring goes up, and that's what everybody's looking for as it relates to how to increase our ring if we're not necessarily going to be able to increase our spend. Said another way, as a restaurant operator, one of the ways that you're going to attract millennials is bundling. And by bundling, I don't necessarily mean buy one, get one free. What I mean is showing the millennials that you can get a beverage with some sort of food and those things go together, and there may or may not be a price advantage of doing them together, but certainly the opportunity is there. We ask kids what they want at restaurants, so you've seen these. These are what kids are eating at home. So if you're dealing with a restaurant operator, you want to know what kids are eating at home and say, okay, if we're going to get kids to come and feel comfortable at our restaurant, what else might we consider for our menu? In terms of flavor preferences, this is a really interesting exercise. You can see how this changes over time. And if we would go from younger to older, if I went to seniors over here, what I would have would be no salt and horseradish. And so kids are looking for sweet. Gets a little more sophisticated here with Thai and Japanese. And as we would grow by group by group by group over time, the flavors get a little bit stronger, and then you kind of get older, and for folks who are older, they're not necessarily so concerned about the flavor of their food. They've identified what they really like, and they're willing to stick with it time after time. And this is the last thing we have to remember. Things are changing at schools. Vending machines are being pulled out. If vending machines are remaining, there's a lot of regulation in terms of what's there. And frankly, that's having an influence on what kids are learning how to eat and eat healthy. If they're doing it at school, they'll continue to do it when they're away from school. So if we kind of take a step back and we go, what the heck does all of this mean? Well, there's a couple of key takeaways. First of all, if restaurants are going to be targeting kids, you really have two audiences you have to target. One is kids, and then their parents. So if you have something on your menu that's attractive to parents, you have to have something on your menu that's also attractive for the kids. You can't do one or not the other. And if you're going to bring kids in, there has to be something that are going to keep kids occupied while their parents are eating. These are some examples. These are things that make parents happy because for it to be a painful experience in a restaurant means that parents not necessarily going to go back. Number 2 is Gen Z, as well as millennials, as well as Gen Z's parents, are concerned about the healthy nature of food. And so to talk about things on the menu as being natural or organic or tell sustainability stories, you're going to engage and appeal to people. So you have to create that whole sense of experience. So think about Chipotle, for example. Their food isn't necessarily healthy, but the way they describe their food, where it's sourced from, how close, all their fruits and vegetables are that they use, that's an important thing to millennials. It's also an important thing to Gen Z. And then finally, there's the whole idea of use of technology. And we see a lot of full-service restaurants are starting to put tablets and pads on their table. Part of that is to speed up ordering and payment. Part of it is to keep people entertained while they're there. So if you're talking with operators, what do they have from a technology point of view that's going to help keep their audience entertained? And that might be nothing more than having Wi-Fi, because lots of times you see parents bringing their kids into restaurants and they're playing on an iPhone or they're playing on an Android, and all they need is that connectivity. So there's all sorts of different things that can be done to help make it a more kid-friendly place, or a place that kids are going to be willing to go back to. So there's a lot of different ways to appeal to households with kids, and I think as manufacturers, we all need to talk about not only the foods that we can offer up and make more kid-friendly, but also ideas on how to do more than just offer food. What are the other incentives that we need to do to have kids come into the restaurant? And with that, I'm done. So I'm willing to take questions from anybody who has any questions for folks who have listened in.
Warren, we got a question come in.
All right. Ready.
So why have households with kids stayed away from restaurants for so long?
I think what happened in the recession was a lot of discretionary income went away. People lost jobs, or people changed jobs, and the income that they are making today isn't what they were making before. And I think, as people are having kids, or people had kids, they become very concerned about what they should be doing with what little discretionary income they have. So should they be saving their money? Should they be putting it in, college funds? Should they be buying their kids new clothes? All those kinds of things. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is there are more people finding jobs, but wages have generally been pretty stagnant. And so there hasn't been a lot of wage growth. And I can certainly say at NPD that's been the case. And so, I think what's going on is people are just cautious on their spend, and it's just less expensive and less risky to feed your kid at home than it is to get them to a restaurant. And the other piece to it is, I think, kids are maturing much earlier these days than they have in the past, and I think they're just not enamored with restaurants as I might have been when I was a kid, or when my kids were 10 or 15 years older or younger.
Great. Interesting. Thank you. All right, Warren, we had another one come in.
Okay.
So you were talking kind of about the recession and cutting back during that time. Is there an expectation that demand will return to where it was pre-recession, or are we never going to make it back up to that level? What do you think?
My guess is especially with households with kids, I don't think there's going to be a big increase in the number of visits amongst those households going forward. I think in general, we've cut back a lot. We've cut back 18 visits to restaurants overall. I kind of feel like this is the new norm. I think what's going to end up happening is you have a base of people who are going to restaurants. Where they're going to go is going to change. And so, for example, a lot of the trend that we've all been experiencing over the last couple of years has been a movement away from traditional fast food or quick service restaurants, and people are going to fast casuals more, or people are using C-stores or supermarkets a little more. So there's going to be more switching around. But I think what that means is restaurant operators have to be more on their toes, and they have to be more following trends, and they have to understand that they can't just keep doing the same old, that they have to really modify the way that they're doing business so that they can continue to attract people to their stores. Because if they don't, people are always looking for something new and different. And so in order to do that, something new and different, Americans are either going to switch to a place that's cool and hip and interesting, like a fast casual, or they're going to go to an established sort of restaurant that's going to have an interesting new menu item, whether it be a food or a drink. And I think that's what restaurant operators need to do. And I think this is something that every restaurant operator needs to do with the help of their manufacturer suppliers, is really keep on top of those trends, because we're not going to see that same sort of organic growth that we were seeing in the early 2000s. In the 1990s, when if you built a new restaurant, people would come to it.
Sure. Great. Any other questions for Warren? All right. If we have no other questions, then we'll close out. Thank you so much, Warren, for taking the time today to share those insights on the next generation. We really appreciate it.